Okay, welcome everyone to session 3 of the JSTP conference. The session is on gender and labor, and I'm Anjana Thampi. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Jindal Global Law School. And I'm very happy to be moderating the session today because it has 4 very interesting papers. And I'm really grateful also to Geeta and Shivangi, the coordinators of the conference, have been doing a very excellent job. And also to Grishma, who's going to be rapporteuring the session today. So welcome to everyone. And I'll just briefly perhaps introduce, or maybe, I'll just briefly introduce the speakers and then we can get started. So as Geeta already told us, we can have a 20-minute presentation. And I can send you a private message about 2 minutes before your time is up, so that, I hope that will help you keep yourself within time and also help you get useful inputs at the end of your work. So we would have Sankalp Sharma first, who is a research associate at Development Data Lab. Sankalp is going to be presenting co-authored work on a latent class approach to female exclusion from the Indian labor force. And after that, we'd have Tista Mukherjee, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Calcutta. And Tista would be presenting, again, co-authored work on patriarchality and the effect of that on various indicators of women's status in India. Tanu Gupta is a research scholar at Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. Tanu has a paper on women's inheritance rights and how that affects time use in India. And Deepa E is an independent research scholar who's going to be presenting on essentially paid domestic work and dual informality of that. So let's get started. Sankalp, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. So let me quickly share screen and get started. Let me know if my screen is visible.
Yeah, we can see.
Perfect. That sounds great. So let me quickly start right away. So this is joint work with Dr. Soumya Dhanraj and Dr. Vidya Mahavre on profiling female exclusion from labor markets. Just to give some context on why we are doing this, there has been a consistent decline in the labor force participation rates, despite India having the second largest population, working age population in the world. As you can see on the graph on your left, from a 71% employed to population ratio in 2004-5, it has now come down to 58% in 2018 and 19. And the reason this is critically important is because the medium-term economic recoveries post-COVID is dependent on how job recoveries happen in the aftermath of the pandemic. So therefore, it becomes critically important to identify who are the people who are vulnerable in the labor market and what the composition looks like. One of the most vulnerable people in the labor market are females, as we know, and has been a long-standing topic in the gender literature on India. And we see that the decline in FLFP has been significant over the last, since the beginning of the 21st century. As you can see on the graph on your left, in urban areas, female labor force participation has remained at a low but steady rate between somewhere of 17 to 16%. And in rural areas, we see a very significant and a concerning decline from 33% in 2004-5 to a mere 19.6% in 2018 and 2019. So what we see here is that there are vast dissimilarities in the composition of those who are not participating in the labor force. And one quick heuristic metric for judging that is the Duncan Dissimilarity Index, which basically tells us how segregated is the composition of a particular group. So a measure of Duncan dissimilarity of 1 would indicate perfect similarity. That is, there is equality between the share of those who are participating and not participating in the labor market. So what we see here is that the Duncan index has been increasing over time, indicating that it's the females who end up facing the excess burden of not being able to participate in the labor force. And therefore, we know that there are these vast heterogeneities that exist in the demographic characteristics of those females who are not participating in the labor market. That not only makes policy targeting difficult, but also quite ineffective. To solve this policy problem of not being able to know the composition, because there is a large literature on the determinants of female labor force participation, but very limited literature in the Indian context on the composition of females who are not participating in the labor market. And we think this is particularly important because it helps in three immediate aspects of policy formulation. One, in terms of greater ease of policy targeting, and secondly, of tailoring the policies to the specific typologies of OLF women, and lastly, on focusing and prioritizing policies that can help in better reintegration of females back into the labor force. And we think this is particularly important in the aftermath of the pandemic. So let me take a couple of slides now to talk about the latent class approach, both in terms of its relevance and its model setup and estimation. In terms of the why of latent class, in terms of why is it a relevant approach to identifying the different typologies of women who are out of the labor force, is because it uses the observed characteristics of females to identify the classes of women who are different amongst each other. So the broad idea of a latent class approach is the different latent classes that we'll obtain will be very similar within the women within the latent classes will be very, very similar, and those between latent classes will be highly dissimilar. So we know that a particular latent class is likely to have very similar women in terms of their demographic and other characteristics that I'm going to describe in the next couple of slides. So statistically, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be computing a score which will come from a maximum likelihood estimation method, and we will classify women into separate and mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive latent classes based on this idea. And this approach is not just the first time it's being applied. In the Indian context, we think it's the first time somebody has been using this approach. But in the European literature on labor markets, it's been extensively used to characterize labor market segmentation. For example, in the Lukács 2019 paper that uses the latent class approach to characterize people who are not participating in, people who are participating in 11 different European countries, even Yan and Chung, who look at labor market segmentation in the United Kingdom. So let me talk a little bit about the latent class model. In the latent class model, we have essentially two parameters of interest. One is the latent class probability given by gamma C, and an item response probability, which is rho J. So a latent class probability tells us the probability of a female belonging into a particular latent class, which are BC, that is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. An item response probability refers to the probability of observing a specific characteristic of a female conditional on them belonging to a latent class. And let me describe how these things work in tandem with each other. So the way we're going to estimate this model is that we're going to be observing the so we're going to have a bunch of observed characteristics of females, both demographic, of household characteristics of females, as well as the labor market characteristics. And we're going to be estimating the probability of observing a given response vector of a female conditional on them belonging to a latent class. Statistically, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be estimating this conditional probability function, that is y equal y, which is the observed response vector, conditional on belonging to a latent class C, which will be given by a dual multiplicative term of rho J and gamma C, which is the latent class probability and the item response probability. We're going to be estimating this via maximum likelihood estimation that will give us the most efficient estimates under certain normality assumptions. After we obtain the parameter y, obtain the probability of observing a response vector conditional on the latent class, to obtain which latent classes women belong to, we're going to invert the probability function by calculating the probability of a woman belonging to a latent class conditional on observing their particular response characteristics by using Bayes' theorem. So we already have estimated this particular function P of y equal to y conditional on L equal to C. We're going to be multiply this by the marginal probabilities of belonging to a particular latent class and having a particular response characteristic. And then we're going to obtain this particular functional form by using Bayes' theorem. So ultimately what we have done is that we have estimated the probability of a woman belonging to a particular latent class conditional on them having these certain characteristics that I'm going to be describing very shortly. And using that, we have grouped women into different latent classes, which makes them as similar within the group and as different across groups. Let's talk now a little bit about what data and what are the covariates that we've chosen in the model. Our data comes from 2 rounds of the employment unemployment survey, specifically 2004-5 NSS, the 61st round, and the periodic labor force survey of 2018-19. The reason for choosing these two particular years is a 14-year gap, which allows us to look at medium-term changes in the latent classes over time. Our subsample is going to be the women between 20 to 59 years who are not participating in the labor market. Let me make one distinction pretty clear, is that there is a difference between not being employed and being out of the labor force. Not being employed would imply that a woman is looking for work but is not able to find any. Being out of the labor force implies non-willingness to work. These are women who are not willing to participate in the labor market at all. And that's why we think this is important to understand and apply the latent class approach to this specific subset of women. The three, in terms of variables that we have chosen to estimate the latent classes, can be broadly characterized into three different categories. One of demographic variables, which would include things like age, education, marital status, and whether or not they live in rural or urban areas. We're also going to be choosing some household variables, such as whether or not the women live in households with the presence of children, and women in households who have male employed people within their households, which gives us a sense of the substitution effects operating within the home itself. And finally, labor market status of women, which tells us whether or not, so even within women who are not working, we can further characterize them into domestic work, women who are in education, and who are not working due to other reasons such as disability, or whether they're remittance recipients, and so on and so forth. So all these response vectors or these covariates taken collectively constitute the response vector Y that I've described in the previous slides. So using these variables, we're going to be estimating the latent classes that we observe. But before that, I'm going to talk about how we are determining the number of optimal classes in the model itself, because we can have multiple latent classes that we can estimate. So the way we determine the number of optimal latent classes is by using a heuristic test called the ELBO test, which uses two different metrics, that is Akaike information criterion and the Bayesian information criterion, to determine the optimal number of latent classes. So we have estimated this model separately for 2004-5 and 2018 and 2019. So in the 2004-5 model, we observed that the fourth latent class, or the four latent classes, are optimal because between the fourth and the fifth latent class, there is a less than 1% change between AIC and BIC. Similarly, in the sixth in 2018-19, six latent classes are found to be optimal because between the sixth and the seventh latent class, the difference between both AIC and BIC is less than 1%. So we see that in both these cases, we are able to determine the optimal number of latent classes, 4 for 2004-5 and 6 for 2018 and 2019. So what are these latent classes and what do they look like? So in 2004-5, we obtain, and I'm going to be talking about how we are labeling these latent classes as well. In 2004-5, we see there are four latent classes. One which of including elder, married and unlettered women. Second one being that of young, married and unlettered women. Third one being that of middle-aged, married, urban and financially secured women. And lastly, that of urban, young and educated women. We see that for 2018 and 2019, we have the same three latent classes as that in 2004-5, which are structurally similar. In addition, we also have three latent classes, which are middle-aged, married and unlettered women, young married women with household dependents, and finally, young women in education. Our focus for this paper is only going to be women which have only going to be those latent classes which are similar over time. That is EMU, YMU, and MFS. We think that it allows us to study changes in the composition of women belonging to these latent classes over a large period of time. And that's why we're focusing on these three latent classes in particular. So just to give you a sense of how we arrived at the labeling of these latent classes and what are the key characteristics of these latent classes, we see for the elderly, married and unlettered women, most of these women in 2004-5 belong to the 30 to 59 age group, and 99% of these women have been ever married women. We also see that 95% of these women in 2004-5 were in domestic work, and a large chunk of these women belong to those households in which there were males working in non-regular wage and salaried employment. So these were women who had males in the household who were working in mostly informal employment. Also, these women are 99% of these women in the sample have only up to primary education, indicating a very low level of human capital within this latent class. And in 2018 and 19, we observed that almost 97% of these women were between the 50 to 59 age group, hence the elderly component of the EMU latent class. And we see that other characteristics also don't change much over time, making these classes structurally similar even across a large period of time, and can allow us to compare outcomes within the composition of these latent classes. We also see that the prevalence of this latent class, given by the latent class probability parameter gamma j, has also decreased significantly over time from 43.6% in 2004-5 to a mere 13.2% in 2018 and 2019. Now let's look at the young, married and unlettered women. We see that they are young because in both 2004-5 and 2018-19, all women in this latent class belong to the 20 to 29 age group. We also see that almost 97 to 98% of these women in both the years were in domestic work, and they were also married, like more than 90% of them were married. We also see that they have a very little education as well, with all the women in this latent class having only up to primary education in 2018-19, which is still an improvement over an 82% in 2004-5. And also we see that the number of women in this latent class also happen to have a high degree of household dependency, in terms of 79% women in this latent class having at least one child in the household. And finally, let's look at the MFS latent class, or the married and financially secured women. The reason we call them married and financially secured is that, one, they live in households where more than 46% males are in regular wage and salaried employment, indicating a high degree of financial stability. While this number declined, it still remains significant at 37.6%. And we also see that they are heavily urban women, indicating that there might be, by a combination of them being urban and having high financial stability, they might be less likely to reintegrate themselves back into the labor market. Let's now move on and talk a little bit about how we're quantifying vulnerability in this particular context. So we are looking at three axes of exclusion. So exclusion can happen on three grounds, that is economic deprivation, social marginalization, and a location barrier. And these are very critically important constraints that limit labor force participation for women. And this has been studied across multiple contexts. The way we're going to be characterizing this vulnerability is by comparing the household consumption, which we take as a proxy for economic deprivation. We're also going to be looking at the prevalence of women in each latent class across social groups. And we're also going to be looking at the within as well as between state variation of the prevalence of these latent classes over time and across states. Let's first look at household consumption. In terms of household consumption, we see that the young, married, and unlettered women have the lowest household consumption given by the NSS and the PLFS in a 30-day time span. With them, while the consumption has gone up over time, it still remains the lowest among all the latent classes. We also see that the EMU latent class has the second lowest consumption in both 2004-5 and 2018 and 2019. The third observation to take note of here is that the MFS latent class, that is the class of women in urban areas and having a high degree of financial stability, have the highest consumption amongst all the latent classes in both 2004-5 and 2018 and 2019. This indicates that both the YMU and EMU are the vulnerable latent classes, with the YMU being one of the most vulnerable latent classes. In terms of the second axis of exclusion, that is social marginalization, let's first look at the 2004-5 composition of women. So if you look at the graph on your left, it tells us that within scheduled tribes, what is the proportion of women in each latent class who are scheduled tribes. So we see that the EMU and YMU are the most prevalent latent classes in the scheduled tribe social group, indicating that the vulnerability is not just limited to economic deprivation, but also in terms of belonging to socially marginalized communities. We also see that in the others, or the forward category social groups, there is an excess prevalence of the married and financially secured women, indicating that they're not only just economically better off, they're also socially belonging to much better, like much higher social categories as well, and not to that of social marginalized groups. The same trend also persists in 2018 and 2019, where we see that both EMU and YMU again are overrepresented in the economically, in the socially marginalized latent classes, and the MFS again being overrepresented in the socially forward social groups. Let's now talk a little bit about the spatial distribution of these latent classes in terms of where do the women in these latent classes belong to. So in 2004-5, we see that the YMU latent class, that is the latent class of the young, married and unlettered women, which we know from both household consumption and social marginalization are one of the most vulnerable latent classes. We see that in 2004-5, most of them belong to the Bimaru states of Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, or so on and so forth. But the good news here is that they have been declining. The share of the YMU women in the overall composition of the women out of the labor force has declined significantly over time, with now looking in the year for 2018-19, with them having very low representation across the board and in all Indian states. But the story doesn't end here. The problem is that within states, there is significant heterogeneity in the share of YMU women or vulnerable latent class females within the states or different states across India. So just to give you a snapshot of two states in particular, that is Rajasthan and Bihar, we see that within Bihar, even though the share of YMU women may have gone down over time, in 2018 and 19, there are still certain districts within Bihar that have a very high prevalence of the YMU latent class of women. Even within Rajasthan, there is still a very high prevalence of the latent classes of vulnerable latent classes. So we see that this is a particularly problematic trend, which needs to be addressed by policy making in general. So just to also give you a snapshot of the MFS women, we see that the share of MFS has also gone up over time. And we see that this is a particularly problematic trend, given the fact that they might be more difficult to reintegrate back into the labor market. So just the key takeaways and what needs to be taken away from the presentation, we know that we now can clearly see a pattern in which understanding the composition of these females who are not participating is particularly important. And a large part, we think, of the declining FLFP can be attributed to the rise in the share of women who belong to the MFS latent class, for whom there might be high substitution effects within the household and might be more difficult to reintegrate back into the labor market. And therefore, we think that the latent class approach can give us more actionable insights into some policy relevant compositional differences. So yeah, thanks so much. And I look forward to the questions and comments and any feedback as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Sankalp. It was perfectly on time. And as you said, this is quite a new approach in the sense I haven't seen, even though there is a vast amount of literature on FLFPR, I haven't seen this kind of an approach. So I'm sure that will lead to a lot of discussion. Teesta, would you like to go next? Sankalp, you might need to.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So I think the screen sharing is disabled.
Oh, I think Teesta needs to be made a co-host.
Yeah, right.
Sam, are you there? Sam, are you there?
Yes.
या आप तीस्ता जी को भी बना दीजिए ना co-host. हाँ.
It's Tista.
तीस्ता मुखर्जी. या. उनका presentation है अभी. या.
Done.
Yeah, you can now.
So can you see this?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So a very good afternoon, everyone. And I'm delighted to be present here today. And I would start thanking the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity. So let me start. Today I'll be discussing a part of my doctoral dissertation that seeks to evaluate the causal impact of patriarchality on Indian women's status. So if I need to motivate the study with 3 stylized facts, the very first would be that gender inequality is prevalent in all societies. So women are lagging behind men in all domains of everyday life, and that disparity is higher in developing societies. Now, economic underdevelopment obviously partly exploit this phenomenon, but unfortunately, it is not enough to secure economic development to promote gender equality across societies. That means keeping the level of development constant, there are so many other factors that help us explaining some of the variation in women empowerment across societies. And in recent social science literature, the country-specific cultural institutions are at the forefront to explain those variation. And in this paper, we would talk about a particular cultural institution, that is patriarchality. So first, I would formally introduce the term patriarchality. It is a widely practiced cultural institution that shapes the rule of post-marital residence among newly married couples. And according to this social norm, a woman ceases to be a part of her natal family and co-resides with her husband's family forever once she gets married. Patriarchality is more common in countries like South Asia and countries of Middle East and in North Africa as well. And if we see in Indian context, the northern region is more exploited to exposed to patriarchal norms, and that leads to pronounced gender inequality in northern states compared to south. Now, patriarchality appears to be one of the leading causes of gender gap in developing societies. It creates a clear taste for discrimination towards girl child, and the presence of marriage customs like patriarchality shapes son preference. That helps us explaining the missing woman phenomenon, which is probably the starkest manifestation of gender inequality across globe. And patriarchality also shapes financial mindset of parents to deliberately underinvest in daughters in terms of schooling, immunization, and so on. And such community neglect toward girl child increases when the families are in acute liquidity constraint. Specifically in Indian context, we see that patriarchality or some marriage customs like patriarchality that typically raises the cost of, increases the cost of raising a girl child. And that is why parents often state that raising a daughter in India is just like watering your neighbor's field. And so is true for the countries like China and countries in the Middle East. The post-marital consequence of patriarchality is similar. So in a very recent paper, Khalil shows that patriarchality undermines women's decision-making power and autonomy in South Asian countries. And in the same study, we find that women, the young brides, are more exposed to domestic violence if they live in a patriarchal setup. And in Indian context, we have lots of convincing evidences that shows patriarchality restricts women's labor market participation. However, in a cross-section data set or cross-section setup, the biggest challenge to evaluate the patriarchality or the impact of establish the impact of patriarchality would be to address the endogeneity bias. In Indian context, we have 2 studies so far that addressed this earlier, that issue earlier. So first, I would mention a pioneering work by Debnath, where he used death of the patriarch as an instrument for joint family breakdown. And using that instrument, he shows that such norm significantly reduces married women's autonomy, labor force participation, and bargaining power in the context of rural India. And using the same instrument, Dhanraj 2019 shows that co-residence has significant deterrence effect on married women's non-farm employment in Indian villages. But just remember that patrilocality is something that is not confined to only in the rural India. Even in the urban India, the post-marital residence of newly married couple is largely determined by the patrilocal norm. And there are sufficient evidence that shows even in the era of urbanization, majority of newly married couples still live in a patrilocal setup. So I would produce data-based evidence. So this graph is from Indian Human Development Survey data, 2011-12. And here we can see the distribution of patrilocality across regions. And we see that a large fraction of the women, married women, still is continuing to remain in the patrilocal setup. So in this paper, our primary objective would be to establish the causal impact of patrilocality that is robust across regions. That means we would establish the causal impact that can be applied to both rural and urban Indian context. So this is the overview of next couple of slides. So now I would introduce the technicalities. So we are using data from Indian Human Development Survey 2011-12, and our primary variables of interest are patrilocality and women's status. So we use these informations from the women's schedule of IHDS questionnaire. And since we are looking at the young brides, we will restrict our sample to respondents up to 35 years. And that gives us the sample size of 19,224 young married women. And to have a richer controlled environment, we also combined our women's data with household and individual level data sets. So here I would describe the variables. So our primary interest is patrilocality, which is going to be our endogenous covariate. So we are measuring patrilocality by using a binary coincidence indicator that takes value 1 if the respondent is daughter-in-law of the household head. And we have 4 sets of outcome variables that are intra-household bargaining power, autonomy of mobility, work, and welfare. So intra-household bargaining power is measured by most say index that assigns value 0 if the woman has most say in none of the household decisions, and it takes a highest value of 4 if she has most say in all household matters. Similarly, autonomy of mobility is measured by autonomy index that assigns value 0 if she can't go anywhere without permission, and a value 4 if she doesn't need permission at all. And we use 2 indicators of women's work. One is most say in decision to work. So that means whether she enjoys some power to decide about joining a job. And finally, the work participation measures their visibility in the labor market. So it's a constructed variable, and it measures whether she works as an agricultural wage labor or non-agricultural wage labor or in a salaried position. Our final construct is welfare. So we use 2 indicators here. One is availability of cash in hand that measures whether she avails some cash to spend on her own. And finally, the access to refreshment measures whether she sometimes goes out with husband or children to consume some leisure goods like cinema, restaurant, and so on. So equation 1 gives the baseline specification. So here yi represent an outcome variable for young bride I, a member of household H belonging to religion R and caste C in the state S. And patrilocality measures whether she is daughter-in-law of the household head. And we are incorporating religion, caste, and state fixed effects. And we use individual, spousal, and household level controls. And we also use some additional household specific controls that are household's economic status, asset details, and access to media. And in work and autonomy related specifications, we are using community level crime against women as one of the controls. So our primary parameter of interest is beta. That gives us the impact of patrilocality on women's status compared to one not residing in in-laws, not residing with in-laws. So here is our baseline regression results. So first, our outcome variable is women's bargaining power. So here the final column gives us the full model after controlling for all other factors. So we find that women residing in a patrilocal setup are 78 percentage point less likely to have most say in all decisions, all household decisions compared to the women who are not in a patrilocal setup. Similarly, for autonomy index, we find that women living in a patrilocal setup are 29 percentage points less likely to enjoy unrestricted mobility compared to women who are not in a patrilocal setup. And similarly, for all outcome of interest, we find that the result is consistent and has negative impact, which is statistically significant. So patrilocality reduces women's decision-making power about work. It also reduces women's visibility in the labor market, and in terms of probability, that magnitude is 31 percentage point. Similarly, they don't have cash in hand if they are in a patrilocal setup. And finally, they are 5 percentage point less likely to have some access to refreshments if they are in a patrilocal setup. So to sum up, controlling for all other factors, women in the patrilocal setup so patrilocality undermines women's socioeconomic status in India, and that impact is robust to rural and urban regions. So we conducted a subsample analysis and we find no evidence of heterogeneous impact. This means for all outcomes of interest, there is a strong deterrence effect of patrilocality on women's status in both the regions. So this is all about the baseline regressions. Now I would come to the causality thing. So in a cross-section setting, we need to address the endogeneity bias, and I would be using instrumental variable approach to deal with that. So the instrument is drawn based on the literature of intergenerational co-residence among young married sons in developing societies. And the main theoretical proposition is as follows. The post-marital co-residence with parents is a strategic choice of married sons in developing societies, and it largely depends on the housing facilities and housing prices. So the key idea is that it is incentive compatible for both parents and a married son to co-reside after getting married, because the formal channels of housing facilities and old age support is pretty less developed in developing societies. And this becomes incentive compatible since from both point of view, it's a cost saving approach. And there are lots of evidences that shows housing facility strongly determines co-residence. For example, Logan 1999 shows that number of rooms strongly predicts co-residence. And in a very recent study, Mark Rosenweig finds that co-residence increases the financial resources of the youth in China. And he also addressed the endogeneity bias with using the housing prices as an instrument for co-residence. So we just follow this argument and we claim that number of rooms in the house is likely to predict married sons' co-residence with parents, and that is likely to serve as an exogenous variation in young brides' exposure to patrilocality. So following this approach, our first stage would be to predict co-residence by number of rooms. And here we find that the probability of co-residence increases by 42 percentage point when there is one additional room in the house, and that impact is statistically significant. We also transformed our original instrument by transformed it with into binary specifications. So one is whether the number of rooms in the house is greater than 3, and whether the number of rooms in the house is greater than 2. And even in those models, we find that the housing facility strongly predicts patrilocal co-residence. So using this first stage, we will now show the second stage regressions. So here we would predict impact of patrilocality on women's performance after instrumenting with housing facility. So our first set of outcomes are bargaining power and autonomy. And we find that compared to baseline regressions, the impact of patrilocality is not only significant, but they are also larger in magnitudes. So this confirms that patrilocality has negative impact on women's intra-household bargaining power and autonomy. And we are using the standard set of controls here. And since the housing facility could be correlated with households' wealth, so we are using additional controls of households' land holding and households' the family size. So the same is true for women's work, that after instrumenting, the estimate is not only statistically significant, they get bigger. And similarly, for all outcomes related to welfare, we find that there is a drastic change in the coefficient after we use the instrumental variable approach. And interestingly, these IV estimates are also robust across regions. So in both rural and urban areas, we find a negative impact of patrilocality after addressing the endogeneity. Now, we also done a lot of robustness checks, a series of robustness checks. So here I would show a particular robustness analysis where we are using an alternative measure of patrilocality. So which is a binary indicator that reflects whether the respondent woman lives with at least one of the in-laws in the house. So in a similar fashion, our first stage would be to predict patrilocal co-residence by number of rooms. And we find that the probability of co-residence increases by 59 percentage point when there is one additional room in the house. And similarly, our second stage regression shows that for all outcome variables, compared to the baseline regressions, all IV estimates are bigger and statistically significant. So these are all about the technicalities, and we find that patrilocality has strong deterrence effect on young brides' socioeconomic status in Indian context, and that is robust across regions. So both rural and urban regions are exposed to patrilocality, and which is undermining young brides' agency. And now think of the policy choice. So to sum up, women's agency is important, though there is no clear evidence that women are more productive than men. But it's long been recognized in the literature that women are better decision makers. They make better choices for their children, and promoting gender equality would be useful to have a better labor force in the future. And from this study, we find that developing the formal channels of old age support and affordable housing prices in both rural and urban metro cities in developing society would accelerate the process of family change, and that would promote gender equality in turn. So this is the policy choice, but just remember that this type of interventions is not going to be free lunch, because there are trade-offs. Just think of the informal institution of intergenerational co-residence in developing countries, which are very sustainable and popular in their own way. So when we are trying to hit the constraint from either side, that means somebody is going to be the loser. Either they would be the elderly parents, or they would be the married sons. So to intervene in that way, we need to think through this problem, because to promote equity, we often face the problems of efficiency. So that's all about the paper. It's still in a working stage, so I would expect some comments and suggestions that would help me to make some further progress. Thank you very much for all of your attention.
Thank you, Tista. And it's really also interesting to see how there are links between presentations within the session, because you were just talking about the institution of patrilocality, and the next presentation, which is Tanu's, is also on the institution of inheritance and how the Hindu Succession Act has played a role, and whether it has had an effect on women's time use. So Tanu, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Dr. Anjana. So should I start?
Yeah, please do. We can see you and your screen.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Tanu Gupta and I'm a PhD scholar at Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. So I'll straight away start with the motivation. So gender inequality is a worldwide phenomenon. Women are often discriminated against males in various fields like education, labor force participation, political participation, etc. And as a result, they often obtain suboptimal outcomes. And this is especially true in developing countries like India. Now, one of the main reasons for this inequality is the inequality of the inheritance right that favors males and discriminate against women. So I'll show you a figure. So this figure is from World Development Report 2012, and this figure shows the situation of the inheritance right in different parts of the world. So for example, in Middle East and North Africa, all the countries have unequal inheritance rights. Whereas in South Asia, 50% of the countries have unequal inheritance rights. And overall in the world, 1/3 of the countries have unequal inheritance rights that discriminate against women. Sorry. So now if I talk about India, then in India, the inheritance right is governed by the Hindu Succession Act of 1956, which was initially gender biased and did not allow the women to inherit the property. But later on, amendments were made in this Hindu Succession Act of 1956, and the daughters were given the rights for inheriting the property. It is being believed that giving the equal inheritance right to women have the potential to improve their empowerment and their outcomes. In this context, there has been many studies in the literature which have examined the impact of the equal inheritance right on women's outcomes. And these studies have been carried out in the context of India as well as in the context of other countries also. And these studies have focused on variety of outcomes like education, domestic violence, autonomy, female feticide, son preference, and so on. But there is a lack of study that have examined the relation of the equal inheritance right and time use allocation. So far there has been no study that have examined the impact of the equal inheritance right on women's time use allocation, and this paper attempts to fill this gap. So given this brief introduction, I pause the research question that I answer in this paper, and the question is that what is the impact of the equal inheritance right on married women's time use allocation? Now, since I am doing it in the context of the Hindu Succession Act, therefore precisely, I am answering the question that how does the reform in Hindu Succession Act that gave the equal rights to the women for inheriting property had an effect on the time spent by women on three key activities, that is employment, home production, and leisure. Now, the study of time use is important because it is also the one of the key economic outcome of an individual. Now, before going into analysis, I would like to describe the institutional context of the Hindu Succession Act. So before 1956 in India, there were a few traditional inheritance schemes that defines the rules and regulations for inheriting the property from the previous generation. Now, under all these traditional schemes, there was a clear distinction between the ancestral property and the private property. So the private property refers to the property that is being purchased by an individual on his own, whereas an ancestral property refers to a property which is being inherited by an individual from their forefathers or ancestors. Now, under all these traditional schemes, the women were given no right for inheriting any of these properties. Later on in 1956, all these traditional inheritance schemes were amalgamated into one act, which was known as the Hindu Succession Act. And under this act, the women were now given the rights for inheriting the private property, but still they were not given any rights for inheriting the ancestral property. So in 1956, this Hindu Succession Act was still gender biased. Later on in subsequent years, between 1976 and 2005, amendments were made in this Hindu Succession Act by giving the rights to the daughters for inheriting the ancestral property and to remove this inequality which was there in this inheritance right. So to make the Hindu Succession Act more gender neutral, firstly, 5 states made the amendments in different years. So firstly, in Kerala, it was introduced in 1976, and then in Andhra Pradesh in 1986, and then in Tamil Nadu in 1989, and then later on in Maharashtra and Karnataka in 1994. And later on in 2005, the Indian state government made these amendments in the remaining of the Indian states to remove the gender inequality in the Hindu Succession Act. Now, since in India, 97% of the property belongs to the ancestral property, therefore, these amendments that happened between 1976 and 2005 holds a great relevance in determining the asset ownership to these Indian women. Now, there were two features of this reform. First, the reform was only, first of all, the HSA in general is only applicable to 4 religions, that is Hindu, Sikh, Jain or Buddhist. And it does not apply to other religion like Christian, Muslim and other religions. Second, these amendments that happened between 1976 and 2005, these amendments were only applicable for those women who were unmarried at the time of the reform, which means that only women who were unmarried by the time of the reform, only they were eligible for inheriting the property. Only they were given the legal right for inheriting the property. So I'm going to use these two features to devise my identification strategy, which I will discuss later on. Now I briefly would like to highlight the mechanism through which this equal inheritance right could have an effect on women's time use allocation. Now, giving the equal rights to women means that now women have the legal ability to inherit the property, which can be interpreted as an increase in their potential unearned income. So therefore, an increase in unearned income could have two opposing effects on women's time use allocation. One is the income effect and the second is the autonomy effect. Under income effect, an increase in unearned income could generate a strong labor-leisure trade-off, thereby inducing a woman to reduce her labor hours and increase her leisure time or home production time. Second, under autonomy effect, an increase in unearned income could raise a woman's control over resources, thereby increasing her gains from working outside. Now, this increase in gain from working outside could actually induce a woman to put more time into labor hours and reduce her time in home production or leisure or maybe both. Now, given the presence of the traditional gender-specific roles in India, it is possible that an increase in time spent in labor hours is compensated by a decline in leisure time without any change in home production time. So this means that it is possible that the women may be working even more by bearing the double burden of the work. So given all these possible combinations, it can be said that the effect of the equal inheritance right on women's time use allocation is a priori ambiguous and needs to be investigated. So to test this hypothesis, I'm going to use time use survey, which is a first nationally representative cross-sectional data, and it was conducted in year 2019. The time use survey records the information on time spent by an individual in different activities over a reference period of 24 hours. And it records the information on all paid and unpaid activities, including domestic work. And it also records the information on time spent in different activities like learning, socializing, self-care, recreation, etc. Now here in my analysis, the main outcome variable would be the number of minutes spent per day in 3 main activities, that is employment, home production, and leisure. Now, what do I mean by home production? So home production mainly include 3 activities, that is domestic chores, childcare, and caregiving to others. And then leisure means the time spent by an individual in religious practices, socializing, recreation, and self-care activities. Here in the analysis, my focus will be on the sample of the currently married women who are in between the age of 15 to 60 years, which corresponds to working age. Now to identify the effect of the equal inheritance right on women's time use allocation, I am going to use a difference in difference method. to identify the effect, where I'm going to use the two features of the reform, which I have already discussed. So the first one was that the reform was in general applicable to only those women who were unmarried at the time of the reform, and it was not applicable to those women who were married by the time of the reform. And second, it was only, the HSA is only applicable to four religions, that is Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh or Jain religion. So we call these religion as treated religion or the Hindu religion. So whenever I'm going to use this word, the treated religion or Hindu religion, I mean that I'm talking about these four religions. So given this, the obvious choice of the treatment group would be to compare, would be the women who were unmarried at the time of the reform and compare their outcomes with the women who were married at the time of the reform across the treated or the non-treated religion. But here there is a problem, and the problem is that the year of marriage could itself be endogenous. Therefore, using the actual marital status at the time of the reform to create the treatment and control group could be problematic. Now, to solve this issue, what I do, I use the age of marriage distribution that was there at the time of the reform rather than the actual marital status which was there at the time of the reform to construct the treatment and the control group. Now, how I'm going to do this? I'll explain this with the help of an example. So this is just an hypothetical example. So let's assume that in 1994, the reform came in Maharashtra, and at that time in 1994, this was the age of marriage distribution in India. And this is just an example. This is not the actual age of marriage distribution. I am just using this to help you to understand how I'm creating the treatment and the control group. So supposedly this was the age of distribution, age of marriage distribution, and then I'm going to take the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile of this age of marriage distribution. Now, all those women who were younger than this 10th percentile of age of marriage distribution at the time of reform, they are more likely to be unmarried at the time of the reform, and therefore they are more likely to be exposed to the reform, and therefore we classify them as treated cohort. Similarly, women who were older than this 90th percentile of age of marriage distribution at the time of the reform, these women are also those women who are more likely to be married at the time of the reform, and also therefore they are less likely to be exposed to the reform, and therefore we classify them as the control cohort. So essentially what I'm doing, I'm trying to construct a younger and older cohort on the fact that that they are more likely to be exposed to the reform and they are less likely to be exposed to the reform. And therefore, this is how I construct my treatment and control group. So in this way, after constructing the treatment and the control group, I'm going to compare the differences in their outcomes between the treatment and the control group across the Hindu and the non-Hindu religion, which means across the treated and the non-treated religion. So to do so, I am going to estimate the following regression specification. So here y is the dependent variable which measures the number of minutes spent per day in three main activities, that is employment, home production, and leisure. And then I have an interaction term of this treated cohort dummy and Hindu dummy. So this treated cohort dummy is a dummy variable which takes value 1 if a woman belongs to a treated group and 0 if she belongs to a control group, as I have discussed in the previous slide. And then this Hindu dummy variable takes the value 1 if a woman belongs to the treated religion and 0 if she belongs to a non-treated or non-Hindu religion. And then I have as the single term of treated cohort. And then I have added the religion fixed effects. Now, since I am adding the religion fixed effects, therefore the single term of this Hindu dummy will drop out from the main regression specification. And then I have also controlled for year of birth fixed effects. And then I have also added the religion year of birth fixed effects. And next I have controlled for the first stage unit fixed effects. So these first stage fixed, these FSU fixed effects are nothing but the so these FSUs are the primary sampling units which have been created by dividing a state into different sub-regions, which are nothing but either the villages or the urban towns, depending on whether they are in the urban area or in the rural areas. So by adding the religion fixed effects, what I'm effectively controlling for the heterogeneity at the lowest level of the geography. So the idea is that after controlling for all these fixed effects, this difference in difference estimator, which is the beta 1, this will give the true estimate of the equal inheritance right on women's time use allocation. So now next I present the results from this specification. So here this box highlights the coefficients of beta 1 or the estimates of beta 1 coefficient. So these coefficients shows that, for example, a woman who was exposed to the reform, she is spending 46 minutes per day more in employment activity. And on the other hand, she is spending 42 minutes less per day in home production activities. And if we look at the time spent in leisure, then there is no change in leisure time, which means that the women who have been exposed to the reform, for them, there is no change in their leisure time. So these findings highlight two key points. First, since the women are spending more time in employment, this means that the autonomy effect is at play, which means that because the fact that the women are the women have now the legal right to inherit the property. This leads to an increase in their autonomy, and thereby this leads to an increase in their gain from working outside. So therefore they are spending more time in employment work. Now the second point which is being highlighted is that these women are basically reallocating their time from home production and diverting it to employment, which means that they are freeing up their time from home production and they are reallocating this time to employment activity. So in a sense, because of the equal inheritance right, a woman's autonomy increases, and as a result, her gains from working outside increases, and therefore she frees up her time from home production and divert it back to the employment activity. And this is without any, and the main point that needs to be highlighted, that this is happening without any change in their leisure time. So this is the key finding of this paper. So next, I have also tried to see how the equal inheritance right has an impact on the time spent in learning activities also. So there I find that the women who have been exposed to the reform, they are spending slightly higher time in learning activity. However, this is not the focus of this paper. So now we have seen that the women who have been exposed to this inheritance reform, they are spending less time in home production activity. And home production activity mainly consists of three main activities, that is domestic work, child care, and caregiving to others. So now to see from where this decline is coming, what I have done, I have re-estimate these results on the individual components of home production. And there I have found that the women who have been exposed to the reform, she is actually investing less time in domestic chores without any change in child care and other care activities. So this shows that a decline in home production for these women is totally driven because she is spending less time in domestic activities, domestic work activities. Now, in addition, there is another interesting finding, and that is that although there is no change in time spent in leisure, but what do we find is that there is a certain reallocation of time across these home production, across these leisure activities. So what do we find is that women who have been exposed to the reform, she is spending less time in religious practices and she's reallocating this time to socializing and self-care activities. Now, since women are spending less time to home production activities, so a natural question arises that is it the case that the other household members of the family are investing more time to home production activity? So my next table is going to show answer this question. So
hi Tanu, sorry to interrupt. Could you wrap up in about 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. So here this treated women variable is defined at the household level. So this figure shows this table shows that even if at least one woman in the household is being exposed to the reform, then there is no change in time spent by the other household members in the home production activity. Now, I have also done some falsification tests. Now, because of the lack of time, I'm not discussing it here right now, so I can discuss this in Q&A session. And then next, I have done some heterogeneity analysis also, and some few more robustness checks. So now I would like to conclude that what this paper finds is that because of the equal inheritance right, women's autonomy increases, and therefore she frees up her time from home production and reallocate this time to employment activity without any change in leisure time. So this paper highlights that, and this result holds a great relevance in the patriarchal society like India, where the domestic work is generally being devalued. So this paper shows that this inheritance reform could be a form of reversal of the devaluing of women's domestic and reproductive work, and it could help the women in overcoming the cultural barriers that come in the way of seeking their paid employment and help them in breaking the stereotypes of gender roles. So with this, I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanu. And I think you already have questions coming in, but we can take them together at the end after all the presentations are done. Okay, so I think you're pointing to an interesting trend of how women's inheritance can actually change or, as you said, reallocate time that is spent on home production towards market work. So the last presentation for this session by Deepa will talk about paid domestic work, people who might be helping us out at home when we have to take up market work, and the nature of those arrangements. So Deepa, could you go ahead?
Is my slide, you're able to see my slide?
No, we can see you, but not your slide yet.
So I should go to the option and say share slide.
Yeah. Share
Yes?
screen.
Yeah. Is it visible now?
Yeah, I think it's just
It
coming,
will be.
probably.
It's just taking
Yeah.
some time.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, it says that you've started screen sharing. I think it's coming, possibly. Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. I think it's just a minute. My system is hanging. Just a minute, please.
Yeah, sure.
Is it fine? Yeah.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, everybody.
My paper titled Gender Public Policy, Dually Informalist Work as Women's Work Choice. I'm going to present it. Actually, I just request the organizers to kind of look into, there was a small mistake on my title. They were published as Human Public Policy. So I would expect them to take this into consideration.
We'll do that.
Yeah, thank you. Paid domestic workers. I would like to say that here, even the panelists, other panelists talking about domestic work. So most of the women does domestic work, but certain category of women workers do domestic work as their employment. So I would be specifically using the term paid domestic work to refer to them. So paid domestic work, as we know, is a single largest category of it's a single largest category of work in any urban center. We could observe that there was two main things happened, especially in the last decade, which is like total increase in number of domestic workers worldwide as well as in India, along with which was combined with increased in number of women's participation in this particular sector of work. But what I would, however, argue that within informal sector work, in the literature of informal sector work, they have been long advocating to bring paid domestic workers under the purview of some kind of social security scheme. But my argument is that within informal sector work, there are works like paid domestic work, which is characterized by another layer of informality in terms of nature of work, indefinite work time, hours of work, etc. Moreover, this kind of informal sector work characterized by dual informality are populated by women because of their choice of work is constrained by the burden of care work at home. So in the literature, when we talk about women's paid domestic work, one of the main reason is that studies have shown that paid domestic work, the flexibility as the main reason for poor women to choose paid domestic work. But they have not defined the term from the perspective of the worker, the nature of work or the salary of payment, etc. So they have also not accounted for how such a flexibility needed to be analyzed from the perspective of women workers' negotiation of their household responsibility and what it means to the workers' free time. So is this a work of flexible work for poor women is what the whole study initially was anchored around. So how do women workers term such work when they choose this work over the other forms of work? Other forms of work, what I mean within informal sector work, there are other forms of work, which is like, for example, housekeeping or construction work, etc. So does this flexibility in the paid domestic work allow women to free themselves to take care of their interest? What do they do with their rest of their hours? How important is their household work in mediating their work choices? So these are the questions which my research tried pondering into. So my survey, along with other narratives of the women workers' narratives, highlight that the work is not actually flexible in the sense of a worker being able to decide how and when and what amount of work to be accomplished in a short time of working hours at the employee's household. So basically, it is a primary research. So the argument of this paper is basically on the data analysis collected through a primary survey of 200 households conducted in informal settlement named Ambedkar Purachi Nagar in Kalliputtai, Chennai. So all the respondents in this means all the response of this in-depth interviews were women who were engaged in informal sector works, including paid domestic work. Data from the census of this informal study, which we had which we conducted a census of a household, and along with key informant interviews conducted by me have also been used for this study. And we have also done 100 in-depth interviews among paid domestic workers. So how do women paid domestic workers understand the notion of flexibility? So is this kind of work a flexible what kind of flexibility or what flexibility are the women talking about? So a significant aspect of poor women from Kallukuttai choosing to work as paid domestic work in their shared perception. They share their perception that with the paid domestic work, they are able to fulfill their household duties along with the simple earning what they will be able to get. So the underlying belief is that women ought to perform her household duties even if she has to earn her living through other means. So it is this perception that leads them to choose work that can accommodate her primary role assigned to her as domestic worker in her own household. The above perception from the workers makes clear that they have a complex response towards the notion of flexibility in paid domestic work, since it is about accommodating their gender roles and responsibilities and not about having their free time for themselves or to choose what time they need to do paid work. The flexibility here would only connote that this work enables the paid domestic workers to earn their living without any disturbance to their domestic duties. So the concept of flexibility, as we understand in that paid domestic work, helps them to manage both their paid and unpaid work. So why certain category of women choose paid domestic? So we saw in literature, and it's been proved in my area of study also, that this is the single largest category of women in any urban center. So in our area, mostly middle-aged women under various constraints take this paid domestic work. So from a primary survey, out of total 100 paid domestic workers respondents, 64% are from the age group of 26 to 40 years, whereas 77% of housekeeping respondents are from the age of 36 to 50 years. So the point here is that women in younger age are burdened with more household work compared to the elderly women. This is so because most of the young women have either small kids or school-going children, and they need to attend to several domestic duties along with childcare, including dropping and picking their children from school. Paid domestic work in these cases allow them to manage both their household responsibilities such as childcare along with earning a simple livelihood. Instead of prescribing to the term flexibility, we would term this work as dually informalized work. So when we talk about dual informalized work, I would like to talk about the first level of informalization and then go into the second level of informalization, which is specific to this work group. The first level of informalization. It is now well recognized that paid domestic work is an informal sector work. For instance, ILO's job-based definition of informal employment is that the employees are considered to have informal jobs if their employment relationships is in law or in practice not subject to labor legislations, income taxations, social protection, or entitled to certain employment benefits. For example, like advance notice of dismissal or severance of paid annual or sick leave, etc. So this definition allows us to cover all unprotected workers in a formal as well as informal settings, including paid domestic work. So paid domestic workers are already, are part of the informal sector work. However, there is an additional layer of informality associated with this kind of work, which is often not recognized or engaged with. When we talk about the second level of informality, there is some certain peculiarity or certain peculiar features which is very much existed only to this work. For example, the workplace. The workplace is the employer's home, which is a private place for the employer, a private space for the employer, but it becomes the workplace for the worker. So when we talk about this workplace as such, most of the employment, there are multiple workers working together, whether it is construction workers, whether it is housekeeping workers. But you see in domestic work, most of the workers work as an individual. She's the only worker in the household, and then she's working in somebody's house. So the otherness is always involved. There's a continuous, monitoring of the kind of a work she does, and everything she has to kind of, there is a very informal relationship should be developed between the employer and the employee. So this one-to-one bargain and the power play all exist in the workplace. It's very peculiar to paid domestic work. Then comes the work time, and there is no fixed or common wages So unpaid extra work and no fixed leave and work nature. So workplace we saw. So now let's go to indefinite work time. So it is difficult to account for the amount of time a worker spends on her work in specific household of the employer. So that is indeed very unique to this sector of informal work, unlike in the case of other informal sector workers. So while there is flexibility of work, as that has been understood within the literature and informal sector work, the on-call duty is very specific to this work, which demands women workers full-time attention, both at home and at work. So one of our respondent, Palani Ammal, she said that we need to go to work when they ask us to come. So this is the key to the indefinite work time. But we also have a commitment in our house. Getting job in houses which suits our timing is a challenge. If it works well, then it will be very good. But most of the time, it will not be compatible. So, so this indefinite work time, for example, like most of the work, as we see, you have a kind of a work time like 10 to 5, or even in the part-time, you have a shift work 6 to 2 or 2 to 6. But here it is an on-call duty, and it depends on the employer's work time, like what time the employer wants the worker to be at the home. So the notion of flexibility is a very big question when we talk about this. So there is no fixed wages for this work. Yeah, we do have, we don't still have a national level policy for fixing up minimum wages for paid domestic workers. Depends on the state governments to fix up the paid domestic workers minimum wage or any other social security benefits. So these are the data which came out. For example, for rupees, you know, like these are the number of workers. So most of them, you know, like they have been paid 20 rupees, 15 to 20 rupees is the largest number. For example, you see in 2000, means in Karnataka, the minimum wage is somewhere between 60. In Tamil Nadu in 2018, they had a wage fixation 2018, which was between 36 rupees to 40. And then there's, I'll talk about Harley and piece rate later. But here, in whatever category the minimum wage is fixed, according to the study, we find that most of the workers do not even get the minimum wage. And it is also very interesting to know that none of the workers knew that there is something called minimum wage, or they are supposed to get for their work. So we don't have a fixed wage for these workers. We also see that the wage differs from household to household, from the area of their work to different area of work. Even for the same work they do, wages would be very different for various households. So it is very informal, informal, a very separate kind of peculiarity which we don't find in any other work. So workers are asked to do extra work, and or most of the time it is unpaid. So demanding extra work from the work by the employee is a very common phenomenon. Almost all the workers said that the employer will either demand or request the worker to perform some kind of extra work, for which most of the time extra payment would not be made. Though the worker aware of such informality of work nature and do consider it as extra work, they are often not in a position to refuse doing the extra work. Instead, they negotiate for other favors from the employer, which may be leave, or which may be an advanced loan, or etc. However, inequality prevails here as the employer decides whether to return the favor or not, while the worker is in constant fear of losing the job in case if she does not carry out the extra work, or if she demands extra wage. So we also find there is no fixed leave for this category of workers. For example, in the 100 domestic workers sample, we find that most of them said they had to work every day, including Sundays, or there was no one day or any weekly day off. So even the workers, when had they four workers said they can take it whenever needed. So that is also negotiable, once only negotiated between the employer and the employee. So some workers said it's 1 or 2 days per month. So it is 2 to 4 days, like 24 workers is 2. That's like 10 workers said Sundays are holidays. So it is just that 10% of workers are given a weekly leave, but all the category are negotiable between the employer and the employee. So there is also this dynamics that the workers have to arrange for an alternative worker if she has to take a leave. For example, a kind of a long leave, whether it is like more than 3 days or 5 days or a week. So the worker in such cases assures the employer that she would arrange for an alternative worker, not only because she's concerned about the crisis at the employer's household, but also because this helps the worker to stay in job without the threat of being replaced by the new worker that the employer might recruit in her absence. But it is not that easy to get an alternative worker. As Shanti said, who will leave their own work and go to save my work? Since it's only 2 households, I will try to finish the work soon. The many workers said that they avoid taking long leave and because non-availability of leave reduced their participation in family functions and rituals. So one of the workers shared, I stopped spending a lot of time on marriages and other rituals in the family, said a worker. It is only a very close relatives function I would have to take leave. Even for funerals, I take a day off and return on the same day. So this upsets her as she feels that this may lead to misunderstanding among the relatives, especially in her native village. So what I argue in this paper is that the policymakers not only need to bring paid domestic work under the social security meant for informal sector works. Definitely, there is a long period of waiting for paid domestic workers policy national level. But also take supplementary measures to address the problem associated with this section with the second level of informality associated with the paid domestic work. Based on above discussion, I recommend the following, some of which have been already taken into account by the policymakers. The house of the employee with the domestic worker should be brought under the ambit of workplace for the time in a day the domestic workers engaged in the work in that house. Just to remind, when the debate on sexual harassment workplace, when the act was implemented in 2012, when the bill was discussed, there was a section where paid domestic workers was excluded from that. Then after a long kind of consideration and lobbying, paid domestic workers were included because there was a debate around how to consider home as a workplace. So this is that is those working hours of domestic workers able to access certain basic workplace infrastructure like restroom and house, which any other worker in either workplace. So when anybody's home is considered as a workplace, so generally, there is a certain standards of workplace has to be required with facilities of water or restroom or place to take rest and like have a lunch and many. So though there is a general understanding, especially after the act of sexual harassment workplace, a home has been considered, especially for this kind of workers, domestic workers, as a workplace. The other dynamics peculiar to this work is still not under consideration, and how this been implemented especially is a very big question. I also want to kind of highlight here is that even under the sexual harassment workplace, there should be internal complaint committees for all the workplace should be formed for the women to complain if there is a sexual harassment happened. But consider the case of paid domestic workers. They can complain. Where do they complain? So they have a provision of external complaints committee, but there is a very huge another kind of a challenge in which the women have to, even when you have a ICC, it's very hard to, like kind of bring prove the act of harassment. So when there is no proof, the woman is working alone in the setting of an employer, and then the complaint is an external committee. And you see, when we had a simple understanding to look into the external committee positions, most of in the district, the collector has to be the head of the committee. But most of the districts, it's not whether implemented, or if it is implemented, it's not executed well. So the next comes the wage. The wage should be fixed on an hourly base or the kind of work it is does. So in the state level, minimum wage fixation also, certain states consider hourly basis, certain states consider kind of work and then fix a wage for them. So this has been covered by some of the welfare boards and minimum wage law for some of the states. However, this needs to be implemented by all other states, as well as with clear specific wage for skilled work like cooking and unskilled work like washing and mopping. There should be a higher rate for hand wash compared to machine wash. For example, if I consider the 2018 minimum wage in Tamil Nadu, so they have categorized unskilled, skilled, they have categorized unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled. So in unskilled, cooking, childcare, and elderly comes as unskilled work. So this is where we need to question the notion of, like the consideration of gendered kind of a history, where for thousands of years, women have been doing housework in their home. So there is a knowledge sharing for centuries, and they take this knowledge to the workplace. You don't have a proper training. So most of the time, these kinds of work, especially cooking or household work, are being considered as unproductive work. So how do we bring this dimension into policy is a kind of a huge challenge. So there should be the next is that there should be a higher hourly wage for early morning work hours. For example, 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. and late evening work hours from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So when there is a cooking involved, the workers are expected to come at early morning, and for the night dinner, they are expected to come late night. So compared to the working hours between 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So either the night employment of paid workers should be prohibited, or there should be much higher wages for these workers of work with additional measures of safety of workplace in place, as it is in case of any other night workers, which the present whatever, even the minimum wage, which is considered by the states, have not looked into these dynamics. So there is also another dynamics of travel involved from the workplace, from the home to the workplace. And there is this whole dynamics of part-time work employment by domestic workers, where they work for 4 houses to 5 households per day. So they travel from one household to another household. So the time travel for the work is not considered as work time. So the work only considered within the house is considered as work time, and the wage is being calculated. So there is a whole different, within the workspace, there is a mobility kind of a question comes, and that should be taken into consideration, understanding the peculiarity of, the second layer of informality. So to conclude, my study argues that the specific problem associated with this duly informalized work needs special recognition by the policy makers. Covering paid domestic workers with social security schemes without addressing the problems associated with the second layer of informality, of this work, has resulted in policies which are not very meaningful to this work. Fixing of minimum wages, welfare measures, legal protection, and the recognition as workers alone are not enough to take these complexities into the account, especially questioning the skilled work. Hence, I argue the need for taking gender as a critical dimension in this duly informalized work by policymakers. So, thank you.
Thank you, Deepa, for raising many of the questions that feminist scholars have been talking about, even in contradiction to several of the interventions that are made in gender. So those are all of the presentations. So let me open the floor for comments, thoughts, questions. And if any of the speakers want to comment on each other's work, that would also be great, because since you're all working on related areas. Yeah. So first, possibly I should take Shushoban's question, because it was put right at the beginning when Tanu was presenting. So if I can read out that question, and Tanu, you could respond.
Yeah.
So Shushoban says that in Heath and Tan, the time distribution of women in paid versus unpaid activities has been modeled theoretically as a binary choice variable, and empirically in the backdrop of HSA, your model has a close resemblance. If you could point out or highlight the main departures from Heath and Tan in terms of model or results.
Yeah. So thank you, Shushoban, for this question. So firstly, the heat and tan have empirically checked only for the labor force participation rate, and they are not actually talking about the time use allocation across different activities. So they are basically, and even they are measuring the labor supply at the extensive margin and not at the intensive margin. Now, given that the home production in itself is one of the main reason in India for women to, being not able to participate in the labor market. So studying the time devoted to home production is also, very important to understand that how all these dynamics, the dynamics in terms of the time use allocation dynamics between the different activities are playing a role in determining the women's participation in employment activity. Now, the second thing is that in India, what happens with these standard labor force participation surveys is that usually in India, women are engaged in home-based activities, which is generally being misclassified as unemployed by the standard national, NSS surveys. Whereas in time use surveys, it is a bit different because whenever the respondent go to the whenever the interviewer goes to the respondent, they ask them that in what sort of activities you are mainly engaged in, and they then the interviewer itself classify these activities based on their paid and unpaid and other activity status, rather than explicitly asking the respondent that whether he is employed or she is employed or not. That's the another point. And the third point is that I am also exploring the intra-household dynamics of the time use allocation between the different members of the household, which has not been exploited in the literature previously. So these are the key highlights of the study where I am, contributing to literature.
Thanks. Shubhashish, could you go ahead?
Hi, I'm Shubhashish. I'm an associate professor at Jindal JSGP. Firstly, I'd like to say that, these are all fantastic papers. It was great just listening to these. So these questions are mostly sort of clarifications more than anything else. So for the question for the first paper, one criticism of what you call latent class models, and these are very close to factor analysis models and so on. I think one criticism is they tend to be very atheoretical. Now you've found these 4 or 5 latent classes. So I guess I'd like to know your thoughts about, how are these theoretically robust groups? Is there a lot of commonality? Not just in terms of, you've shown some statistics which come together, but behaviorally, is it a group that you can identify easily? Because ultimately in public policy, you only get benefits if you're able to sort of attract, if you are a coherent group. And I think part of your argument is that with this kind of an analysis, you'll be a bit better able to target policy. But is this a coherent group? Especially this married and financially secure women. And related to that, just to clarify something, the existing schemes that you have for women, for example, in West Bengal, you have these benefits that are given, welfare benefits to unmarried women. Okay, so is your analysis therefore suggesting that those sort of benefits are better targeted to married and financially secure women? I perhaps am putting it in a bit too stark a way, but I'd like to know your thoughts on that. With respect to the second paper, I'd be conceptually, your conceptualization of welfare, I would be a little careful when I talk about welfare, because that tends to be a very loaded term. So when I say welfare, I'm thinking about, what are welfare programs? Mahatma Gandhi Employment Generation Scheme, that is a welfare program. So when I'm thinking about welfare, I think about that term, but somehow you're using it somehow differently. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the conceptualization of welfare. And one point about your housing, number of rooms in the house. So your claim is it only affects patrilocality, but it doesn't affect women's autonomy. I would think that, the spatial, I mean, the space in a house should have something to do with women's autonomy, meaning that, the lower, the fewer the number of rooms in the house, I would expect less autonomy for women. It could be the other way around, but regardless, I would expect a direct causal, a link from number of rooms in the house to your outcome variable. So I'm not exactly sure about the instruments. If you could explain that. For the third presenter, I have a question for all, so please bear with me. For the third presenter, what happens to this 18 to 22 group? I mean, so basically you just treat the 90 plus and the below 10, and then what happens to that middle group? Does that disappear from the analysis? So a little bit more, if you can tell us about your DD strategy. And for the last paper, I actually read that paper as a sort of contradicting the second paper, because the point you're trying to make is more formalization of paid domestic work. But I would think that once you formalize paid domestic work, the sort of the middle class family will stop high, because that would necessarily mean, obviously, I mean, you basically have to pay more at a certain level. And I would think that it would be the married or financially secure women who would start doing, substitute for the paid domestic work. So in that world, it would seem to be that I don't see how gender equality will be addressed there. So there could be complex sort of general equilibrium effects on gender equality of the sort of intervention that you're suggesting. So your thoughts on that. Thank you. Thank you for please bearing with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhashish, for raising all those questions. Should we go in the same order? Sankalp, would you like to go first?
Definitely. And these are really, really valid questions. And thank you so much, Dr. Shubhashish, for presenting these. So I'm going to quickly address some of the concerns that you have, which are fairly valid. And we've also been thinking really deeply about these questions as well. So first, in terms of the theoretic foundations of the latent class model, while the naming and the framing of the latent classes itself is a subjective exercise, the scientific approach behind the latent class model has been well established in sociology and psychology literature for a long, long time. And it's only very recently that this model, this formalized approach, has been now coming up in the economics and labor market literature. So in terms of that, it's a so the difference between a factor analysis and a latent class approach would be the underlying approach driving the model. So in a factor analysis approach, the construct driving the model are the variables themselves. So you're using variables to model which factors are more relevant and which factors are less relevant. In a latent class approach, the individual itself is the construct that you're looking into. So you're looking at the response vector Y for each individual. So it's more individual driven approach. So what we essentially end up getting is whether or not the specific individual response vector is itself relevant for classifying the women into specific latent classes. So those latent classes themselves are constructed in a way such that you're grouping those women on their own individual response vector into the most similar latent class possible, depending on how many latent classes are considered to be optimal. So that solves the problem, which are things that are limited by looking at the determinant-driven approach of looking at FLFP like determinants or variables that affect FLFP and whatnot. This also ties into the point of how it's relevant for policy, because as a policy maker, I'll be less concerned about, say, what are the determinants within, say, a district that they want to implement a particular policy in, but more concerned about the composition of women that they want to target their policies into. So for example, like in West Bengal, I mean, right now, I wouldn't know which is the most prevalent latent class in West Bengal in 2018-19, but in West Bengal, say, the proportion of MFS women is way higher compared to the proportion of, say, unmarried women, then it would not make most financial sense to invest more in the reintegration of, say, young and unmarried women if they know that the share of MFS is way higher, because that policy won't have a lot of effectiveness, right? So this is how it becomes actionable and directly translatable into policy action, because This is something that's not possible with, just knowing, say, look, determinant X is more important than determinant Y. We're giving clear-cut insights into what's relevant and what's not. So this is where the typology approach becomes more relevant than the determinant-based approach of understanding, labor force participation of females in India. So that's mostly what I have. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Teesta?
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Shubhashish, for these questions. I'm happy to take them. So your first question was the indicators that I have chosen for welfare. So yeah, that is, so welfare is a construct here, and I am choosing two indicators of to measure welfare. One is the access to refreshment, that is the consumption of leisure good, and one is the availability of cash in hand. So here I think, right, the term welfare may oversimplify the construct itself. So we can just sort of think that it represents more the women's agency. So how they have access to how they have some access to cash, so that they can spend on their own, and the access to leisure goods they can have. So yeah, we can alter that, but here we generalize the term welfare in the specific context of women agency. So this is the first answer. And coming to your second question, so the key idea is that we are not predicting women autonomy directly with the number of rooms in the house. So it is an instrument that we have chosen to sort of generate a exogenous variation in women exposure to patrilocality. So the idea is that the housing facilities are essentially likely to predict whether you are in a patrilocal setup. So whether we are co-residing with your in-laws. So when there are when the number of rooms are higher in the house, that means that probability of co-residence become higher, and that variation is exogenous to women's choice. So essentially, the women is not making the choice that I am living with my in-laws, but that decision exogenous to the bride's choice. So this is what the instrument is. And so with instrumenting, our first stage is to predicting co-residence with number of rooms. And then in our second stage, we are producing the second stage results where we are having the impact of patrilocality on women's status after instrumenting with the housing facilities.
Right. So I guess my question is, can you just explain why there is no direct link going from? Yeah, I can understand that you're using patrilocality as a number of rooms as instrument for patrilocality, and then predicting patrilocality, then using whatever you're doing instrumental variable. The question is, why is there no direct link from the number of rooms in the household to the ultimate variable, the outcome variable, women's choice? Just repeat that part.
Right. So you are talking about exclusion risk.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. And I'm saying that space in the household should have something to do with your agency. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, just a thought, just something to think. These are, like potential reviewers might ask these sorts of questions, so it's just worthwhile to think about that.
Teesta, are you there?
Yeah, I think we might have.
Okay, so I'm sure she'll come
Hello?
back. Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear? Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
I was just talking about the exclusion restriction. So you're right. So
Okay.
I was just asking you to sort of defend it a little more, I guess.
Right. We didn't check the validity of the instrument though, but one potential threat could be the direct link of number of rooms in the house, that is housing facility, that can be connected to, that can be interrelated to household wealth. That should have some impact on women's agency. So in our second stage regulations, we are controlling for some extra factors, some additional factors that are household wealth, land holding, asset details, and the family size as well, because they are also going to be interrelated with the number of rooms in the house. So in our second stage regulations, we are using 4 additional controls just to, count those factors that could be related to number of rooms and that could have a direct impact on women's agency.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tanu, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Subhashis, for this question. So as I have explained, I explained earlier also that, the year of marriage could itself be endogenous, which means the actual marital status at the time of marriage would be problematic to use for creating the treatment and the control group. So to avoid this problem, we are using the age of marriage distribution, which was there at the time of the reform. Now the reform itself came at different years for different states. Okay. So for different year, to create the treatment and the control group, we are using different age of marriage distribution that were there at that time of reform. I mean, in that year of reform to construct this treatment and the control group. And this age of, so the women who were, older and younger by that time, so they were forming the treatment and the control group. And the sample is basically the women who were between 15 to 60 years old currently. So for a given, so you can say that for a given state, we are dropping those women who were between 18 to 22 years, but this is not happening for each state and for each year. That's the point. So, so it's not the case that in the sample we are, ignoring the one part of the age group totally from this, from the sample. We are not, so that's not happening. So this is just an identification. I mean, this is how we are identifying the treatment and the control group at different reform time. And the second point, which actually I want to highlight, is that this is just a very hypothetical example. So here the difference appears to be like 4 years, but in actually what is happening is that the difference between the 10th and the 90th percentile is max to max 3 years.
Okay.
Okay.
That clarifies a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the observation. So the basic argument was not even formalizing the workers. The basic argument is just even recognize them as workers. So that's a long
battle.
Battle the workers are doing, because we don't even have a national policy for recognizing them as workers. So then comes the formality, and then comes the challenge of how to divide. So obviously there has been a debate on that, and then there are few kind of discussion which is coming out, is that obviously there should be a gender division of labor within the household, where when the women works outside, or irrespective of she doing a paid work or unpaid work, the men in the household has to take up the household responsibility. So that's kind of a modern thought which we have to kind of start practicing, and it is a kind of a change which is very much necessary for the productivity of the whole society and the development of the country. And the next is regarding the child care or the elderly care has to be seen as a very skilled or a productive work. And then you should have, maternity, not just maternity leave, you should have a fraternity father taking up, child care. So these kinds of provisions would surely, help alternatively bring in to how to understand these domestic workers and how to, formalize them, or what is the necessary things needed. Surely a common social security kind of a job has to be established, whether it is for paid work, paid domestic work, unpaid domestic work, or for any other informal sector works. So when that comes in, many kind of challenges can be kind of addressed. So there should be, the whole debate what feminists is making, the common kitchen, state intervention in childcare, to housing rights, and it keeps counting. Basically, I would say adding up to gendered, a friendly workplace where creatures, in the where parents can bring their children, especially men also can bring their children at workplace, and all these kinds of changes would definitely, help improve the standard of paid domestic workers too. And
Of course,
at
of course.
large,
No, I guess all I was saying was just reading it together with Sankal's paper. And I was thinking that if you want to tackle one
Yes.
problem, basically you need to approach it holistically, in the sense that you tackle paid domestic work. At the same time, you need to tackle the division of labor within the sort of, the middle class household as well. I mean, so it's sort of
yeah, but the question
everything.
comes with respect to vulnerability and power play. Like mostly, most of the high income aid paid, women's work has been shared, or the burden is shifted to poor women in the country. And it's also internationally, it's interdivision of labor. They say, underdeveloped country women travel to developed countries, take up the burden of high income or the developed countries women's household burden. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but then it has to actually rework on women taking up whoever it is. It is like, high income earning women or underdeveloped country or poor women. The question is, should women still continue doing household work? So that is.
Yeah. So at that level, there is absolutely no question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for raising all those questions. Any other questions, comments? And I think the last bit that that Deepa also ended on was really insightful in terms of how, even if we're thinking of improving the state of any one category of workers, that's not necessarily compromising the empowerment of other women and so on. So even if we were in fact to go ahead and talk about formalizing paid domestic work, the rise in wages would not be, I believe, to the extent that then the women who are hiring them then cannot employ them. So I think in the battle, as she put it, we would need to look at several different aspects. And each of the speakers, I think, in the session has raised aspects that are relevant. Yeah. But at the same time, I thought it was really interesting that there are ways to put them together, and like Shubhashish was also doing, to actually find links between these different papers. So yeah, thank you to Geeta and Shivangi for putting those together.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was an excellent session.